In this video, I'll be discussing book Lambda of Aristotle's Metaphysics, and with this book, we'll be wrapping up this series. Now, in book Lambda, Aristotle recapitulates and expands upon, refines his account of the metaphysics of substance, his physics, his ontology of nature, as we might call it. And he goes on from there to develop his theology, or his metaphysical account of God. And this account is going to be integrated with his account of nature. So there will be a question he will be addressing about what the relationship is between nature, and in particular between the phenomenon of change or movement within nature and God. And the conception of God that Aristotle will be developing will not be a conception of religious revelation or derived from religious revelation, but rather one that is constructed to meet the needs of his philosophy. So in Lambda 1, Aristotle begins his review of his ontology of nature, and indeed much of chapters 1 through 5 concern this topic, his physics, where a number of points are repetition from what we've seen before. But here, Aristotle is often more explicit and concise about what his ontology does and does not include. In chapter 1, we see Aristotle declare about the universe that, first of all, if it is a physical whole, its primary constituent is substance. So the universe is a whole containing substances as the primary constituent. And the relational elements are not even beings, strictly speaking, or as he says, in the simple way of speaking. The relational entities here are the items in the non-substantial categories, or the ontological categories other than substance, such as quantity, quality, relation or relative, place, time, position, having, acting, being acted upon. Aristotle is claiming that, strictly speaking, these are not beings. Only substances are beings. He goes on to say that there are three kinds of substance. So the three kinds of substance are, first of all, sensible substances, which are either eternal or destructible. And second, unmoved substances, where he includes here things like mathematical entities, mathematical things, and perhaps the forms would be in this category if they exist. All right, so that's the basic account of the things that populate the universe, as it were. Three kinds of substances: sensible, eternal, and destructible, and unmovable, such as mathematical things and the forms. The first category, the category of the sensible, the study of these things belongs to the study of nature or natural science, natural philosophy, whereas the study of these belongs to mathematical and logical study, which studies the unmoved things. In addition, he observes that sensible substance is subject to change, and that change involves the exchange of contraries, which implies the existence of some underlying thing changing from one state to its contrary. So you have an opposition or opposites. So something goes from being hot to being cool. Something goes from being hard to being soft. Right? These are contraries, but you have the underlying thing that endures the change. This, of course, is nothing new to us if we've been following the previous videos. Okay, Lambda 2. Here, he outlines 4 types of change. So we add to our picture of the 3 types of substances the 4 types of change. And we've seen previously the close, intimate relationship in Aristotle's metaphysics between the concept of substance and the concept of change. These are metaphysically very interdependent terms for Aristotle. These 4 types of change, he says, correspond to the 4 types of question. So, or 4 types of question, not the 4 types of question, but 4 types of question. The first is, what is X? What is X? This corresponds to a change which is simple generation or destruction, period. And he calls this change involving a this. So the first type of change is going to be generation or destruction. The second type corresponds to the question, what is X like? What is X like? And that corresponds to a qualitative change, an alteration. So the second type of change is alteration. Third, we have the question, how great is X? Or how large is it? What size is it, we could say. That corresponds to quantitative change, increase or diminution. Increase or diminution. And then fourth, we have, where is X? The question, where is X? And that corresponds to locational change or travel. So there we have our 4 types of change to complement the 3 kinds of substances. First, generation or destruction. Second, alteration. Third, increase or diminution. Or fourth, travel. So there you have the basic picture of the substances that are and the changes, the types of changes that they undergo. If they change, which of course is not going to be the case with an unmoved substance. But for those that move, they will undergo one of these 4 types of changes. That's the basic metaphysical structure that Aristotle is going on. Change in matter of a thing necessarily involves the potentiality of the matter for both of 2 contraries. So bread dough can rise or collapse potentially. Change in matter necessarily involves the potentiality of the matter to bear both of 2 contrary or opposite states. Everything that changes has matter, although the kinds of matter will differ. In particular, he notes that eternal things are not generated, and so do not have matter capable of generation, although they still possess matter, or may possess matter, we should say. Contrary to many of the pre-Socratics, Aristotle emphasizes the original diversity of matter and of its diverse potentialities, which correspond to diverse actualities. So on page 358, this is number 11 here in our text, where he says, a thing then may potentially be, but what it potentially is not contingent. Rather, different actualities realize different potentialities. Nor is it a sufficient explanation of the world to say just that all things were originally together, as some pre-Socratic philosophers would say. All things are originally together. That's not a sufficient explanation of the world, for things differ in matter. Here's his anti-reductionism again. Things differ in matter. Indeed, why otherwise did an infinity of things come to be, and not just one? Mind, after all, is single, so that if matter too were single, the only thing that would have actually come to be would be what matter was potentially, a single thing. So we need this diversity of matter in order to be able to account for the diversity of things, is what he's saying there. Okay, so Aristotle ends this chapter with a statement of 3 principles and causes. And to create space, I'm going to erase our three kinds of substance that I had earlier, and add three principles or causes. The three principles or causes are form or account, he says, the account. And of course, this goes with this idea that the form is associated by Aristotle with the definition of a thing, the real definition. The second thing is the privation, or the absence of the thing, whatever that is, whatever you speak of in giving the account of the form that the thing has, the privation would be the absence of it, as when a living thing dies. It's the privation of life, the absence of life. And then three, the thing that bears either of these two contraries, namely the matter. So these are the three principles or causes. Now, of course, we might naturally recall Aristotle's famous doctrine of the four causes that we looked at previously in an earlier video, and ask, well, how does this account of the three principles or causes relate to that? What happened in particular to the efficient cause and the final cause? And Aristotle doesn't say here, but we'll see as we proceed through Lambda what the importance of this particular conceptual apparatus is within the context of his theology. To be sure, the efficient and motive cause is not going away. He calls it here the motive cause or the moving cause. That will be reintroduced in the next chapter and will continue to be developed in the early chapters of Lambda. So he is going to reintroduce the idea of the efficient cause or the motive, the moving cause to this account here, because none of these things can account, according to Aristotle, for the composition of a composite substance by themselves. There has to be some external thing, and that's going to be the efficient cause that puts the substance together, so to speak, that combines the composite. But he doesn't mention that yet in Lambda 2. If you look at the bottom of 360, he adds here what's called a supplementary note. He says, motive causes are causes as pre-existent entities, while formal causes are simultaneous. For when a man is healthy, it is then too that health exists, and the shape of the bronze sphere exists simultaneously with the bronze sphere. So he's making the point here that the form or the account, like say the form of health that exists in a healthy man, it exists as an explanation, but it exists only at the time at which the man is healthy. It doesn't explain how the man got to be healthy. For that, we need to posit a preliminary cause, something prior to the possession of the form of health, and this would be what he calls the motive cause. So the motive cause has to be distinct from the formal cause. So we might essentially add this in here. I'll put it in brackets. This fourth cause, the motive, which is what we were previously calling, let's do it this way, the efficient cause. He's going to add this in later. It's needed. It has to be distinct from the form and the matter in order to be able to account for how matters change forms. Okay. In Lambda 3, Aristotle introduces a model of change that has three components. First, it has a thing that undergoes change. A thing that undergoes change, which is identified with the matter. So the matter is going to be the thing that undergoes change. It has a something by which it is changed. Something by which it is changed, which is called the primary mover. And it has something into which it changes, which is identified with the form. So basically, the account of change then is going to utilize these three causes that he's already laid out here. What he's going to say is that this, number 3 here, is the thing that undergoes change. It's the matter that undergoes change. A thing that undergoes change. That's the first part of the theory of change. and that's the matter, the thing that undergoes change. Then there's something by which it is changed, and that would be the primary mover, or the motive force. And then there's something into which it changes, and that is the form. So that's the account of change that he presents here in Lambda. And again, our first thought is likely to be, wait a minute, we saw that he had an account of change previously, and that included this notion of potentiality and actuality. So what happened to potentiality and actuality? Well, once again, Aristotle, it turns out, will reintroduce these later on, and they'll play a very important role in his theology. But here he leaves them mostly implicit. Just to anticipate a bit, he's going to say, as he has already said previously, that potentiality is essentially identical to the matter. So in mentioning the matter, he is also including potentiality in the theory of change. And actuality is going to be the form. So in mentioning the form, he is also including actuality in the theory of change that he's just laid out here. Though he's not explicit about that at this point. Aristotle continues in this chapter outlining four modes of substantial generation: artificial, natural, fortuitous, and spontaneous. And the last two are not analyzed here, the fortuitous and the spontaneous, although he had interesting things to say about them in the physics. For example, the category of chance. Here, though, his main interest is in distinguishing between natural and artificial changes, which he does by distinguishing whether the causal principle is different from or the same as the thing generated. In the former case, you get artificial generation, and in the latter, natural. I mean, the idea is basically this, that in artificial generation, you have a man or a woman who is producing something that is not a man or a woman. You know, it may be an item of clothing, a house, whatever it is, but these things are not human beings. Whereas in the case of natural generation, it's always going to be one member of a species producing an offspring that's a member of the same species. That's what he has in mind there. And that's the main distinction between natural and artificial changes. Is the causal principle different from or the same as, in type, the thing that it's generating? Then he once again distinguishes three kinds of substance. And to avoid confusion, I'm going to pass lightly over this because the idea is similar to what we've harped upon in previous videos. That is to say that it's the hylomorphic conception. You have the matter, which he calls here the this, such, or the underlying material. The thing's nature, which he says is both a this, such, and a condition into which it develops, and then a composite particular. So the matter, the form, and the composite. And that does seem to correspond to what we've seen in Zeta. At least if we take the second one, the thing's nature, to refer to the essence or the what it was to be, and associate that with the species form. In the next paragraph here, he considers the separate existence of the this, such, or natures, forms basically. And he says such forms cannot have separate existence in the case of natural things. So, this is, let's see, trying to find the back here. This is 1078, but it's on page 360. It's the largest paragraph on the page. He says, now in some cases there is no this suchness apart from the composite substance. The form of a house is such an example. It can only have separate existence if the art of architecture is itself a separate existence. Nor is there any generation and destruction of these artificial forms. The existence or non-existence of an immaterial house is of quite a different kind, and also that of health and of every other product of art. So if there is, in fact, any separate existence of non-composites, then it occurs in the case of natural things. So Plato is not wrong to make his forms coextensive with natural existence, if indeed there are forms, But that does not mean that he should have allowed such forms as fire, flesh, and head, for these are all material, and it is the last that is the material of what is most clearly a substance. So what I want to extract from this is that it seems here that Aristotle would be on the side of those who would assert that the species form has no existence if we're talking, I shouldn't even say species form, I retract that the form has no existence, the type has no existence if we're talking about an artificial type of thing, like a castle, let's say, or an automobile. And these things exist only insofar as they're material instantiations of these forms. But he seems to be agnostic on the question of whether natural species forms can exist independently of the particular form matter composites in which we perceive them. He seems to suggest that maybe Plato had a point, that it seems like these species have a kind of eternality that's separate from the particular individuals that instantiate them. He's also agnostic here over the soul, interestingly, the substantial form of a living thing. Agnostic over whether it survives separation. He says it's an open question whether any component survives the dissolution of the composite. Nothing prevents this from being so, and he says, for example, it could be that the soul, as a component of the composite of a particular, that constitutes a particular living thing, that maybe the soul of an animal or a man survives the dissolution of that composite. But we don't know. It seems like nothing prevents it, but we don't know if it is the case. But we definitely can say that if all of the houses are destroyed, there's no such thing as the form of a house anymore. Okay, so that's a bit of an expansion on what we've already seen him say. In Lambda 4, Aristotle asks the question, are the principles and the elements of substance the same as or different from those of relational entities? Are the principles and the elements of substance the same as or different from those of relational entities? Recall that the relational entities here are the items in the non-substantial categories, such as quantity, quality, relation, place, time, position, having, acting, being acted upon. What's at stake in this question? Aristotle here is basically asking whether there is some more fundamental constituent or set of elements of being that both substances on the one hand and then the non-substantial realities like qualities are constituted of. And here he's responding once again implicitly to the pre-Socratic materialist who wants to reduce everything to one constituent element or set of elements like water, air, earth, fire. Aristotle answers that first, this implies that they would be produced from the same things, that substance and quality, for example, would be produced from the same things. But besides substances and the non-substantial realities, there's nothing else for them to be, to begin with. That's just a kind of a bald assertion, but he says, well, okay, what would it be? What would these things be, these elements be? Because besides substances and quality, there's nothing else. Furthermore, Aristotle argues that it's not even possible for there to be the same elements for all things. On 363, he says, this is where it says 2, there on the top of 363, 1070b. How is it even possible for there to be the same elements for all things? No element can be identical to a compound of elements. For instance, neither B nor A can be identical to BA. It is a rider to this that none of the intelligible entities, such as existence or unity, can be an element, for these apply to all composites. What is he thinking here? First, we need to ask what could possibly count as the element here. Aristotle seems to be suggesting that only something like existence or unity could be an element that would be shared in common by both substances and quality, quantity, etc. Hence, it may be helpful here to think about why existence or unity cannot be an element of things. They're not elements of things because the substantiality or quality or quantity that exists is not made up of its existence. I'll say that again. Substantiality, quality, quantity, relation, etc. These things exist, true, but they're not made up of their existence. Rather, in a certain way, you could say it's the other way around. It exists because it is such and such substance or such and such quality. That's why it exists. It doesn't exist because it's a substance. Existence doesn't add anything to the substance or quantity, hence it cannot be an element. And then the same with unity. Another way to make the point would be to say that, okay, let's suppose that existence and unity are common constituents. But if that's the case, then they're common only by way of analogy, because to exist as a substance is not exactly the same as existing as a place or as whiteness. These are at best only analogous. So being is said in many ways, remember. So for those reasons, I think he wants to say that there is no way in which we can suppose things like existence or unity are elements. But that brings us to our first discussion question. Is Aristotle right to hold that there is no more fundamental constitutive layer of elements, no more fundamental constitutive layer of elements that makes up substance or other non-substantial realities like quantity or quality, etc.? Is the question whether such more fundamental elements exist a properly philosophical question in the first place? Or is it one that's better left to empirical science? So, first discussion question, is Aristotle right to hold that there's no more fundamental constitutive layer of elements that makes up substance or other non-substantial realities? Is the question whether such more fundamental elements exist a properly philosophical question in the first place, or is it one that's better left to empirical science? In this way, Aristotle is prepared to allow that form, privation, and matter are elements of things. Right, back to this, form, privation, and matter. These are, quote-unquote, in scare quotes, elements of things, but not in the usual sense of element, for the nature of these elements is going to differ across various cases, and they're only the same elements in an analogous sense. So in the case of color, if you take color, the form would be, say, white. The privation would be black, and the matter would be surface. In the case of day and night, the form would be light, the privation would be darkness, and the matter would be air. So even though we could say that both color and day and night have the same elements of form, privation, and matter, clearly they don't have the same elements in the sense of being constituted by or made up of the same thing. It's just in this kind of abstract or generic sense that we say they have the same elements because they have form, privation, and matter. So that's how he's distinguishing the way he structures his metaphysics from, especially the kind of materialism that you saw in the pre-Socratic philosophers who wanted to say that there are these elements of things. And besides that, it's not enough to posit the elements. He says we also need to posit the motive cause, and that's what we already saw too. And so, again, the materialists are missing something because they thought you could account for the existence of substances purely in terms of material, whereas Aristotle says, no, it's not enough to say you have form, privation, and matter. You also have to explain, well, how did the thing come to have the form it did? And the material itself can't explain that because the material is equally compatible with the privation. You know, air can be, as he puts it, or the sky, put it that way, can be both dark and light. A surface can be both white and black. So we need to have some account, some fourth thing here, some cause or principle to account for why it is one rather than the other. Lambda 5. In this chapter, Aristotle reintroduces actuality and potentiality back into his ontology. He emphasizes that activation, as he's calling it here, or actuality, activation, actuality, is the form's mode of existence, and potentiality is the matter's form of existence. Thus, it's possible for things to have an activated existence or form that's different from its potential existence or material. Besides the integration of actuality, potentiality with the formal material existence distinction, Aristotle is concerned in this chapter to make the point that neither the form nor the material alone can account for the production of a composite. Neither the form nor the material alone can account for the production of a composite. And we've already been alluding to this doctrine. So the universal species form man or human being is causally inert for Aristotle. On its own, it produces nothing. Likewise, the material of a substance is unable on its own to give itself the substantial form of any composite. So what can accomplish this? The answer is the motive or the moving cause, the efficient cause. As he says, it is Peleus that is the motive cause of Achilles, not the principle of man, the form of man in general. It wasn't the form of man, the Platonic form, or even the more down-to-earth Aristotelian species form that created Achilles. Rather, it was Peleus, it was his father, on his understanding of how human reproduction works. So the form itself isn't able to produce a particular composite. That leads to the second discussion question. Is Aristotle correct in his conclusion that neither the form nor the material on its own can account for the composition of a composite substance? Is he correct in his conclusion that neither the form nor the material on its own can account for the composition of a composite substance? Second discussion question. All right, that brings us to Lambda 6. By Lambda 6, the recap of his Metaphysics of Nature is all but completed, and Aristotle turns to the question which in his view is the very point of philosophy, as we saw, the question of the first principles or the ultimate explanations of things. The universe, on his account, as we've already seen, is ultimately made up or composed of composite substances. These, however, each require individually an explanation in terms of a motive or moving cause. Every Achilles, in other words, requires a Peleus. But that implies that Peleus, Achilles' father, needs a cause as well, Achilles' grandfather, and so on back up the chain of prior causes. This naturally leads us to inquire whether this chain of causes has a termination point, a first cause that would be the ultimate mover and explanation of the universe as a whole. This is the line of inquiry that Aristotle pursues in chapters 6 through 7, the central chapters of Lambda, which contain his theology, or his metaphysical account of God. Chapter 6 argues for the existence of an eternal, unmoved substance. Eternal, unmoved substance. So this is the aim and the goal that Aristotle is going to be working towards in the argument of 6. Why must there be an eternal unmoved substance? Why? Well, Aristotle argues as follows. I'm going to reconstruct the argument here, and it's reasonably long. To save myself some writing, I'm going to ask you to write down what I say. I'm going to say it slowly, and hopefully the process of writing it down yourself will help to get your thought processes operating on it, and you can look at it afterwards. Obviously, you could pause the video to make sure you're taking it down correctly. But rather than waste more time that is, of course, fleeting on writing it down here and having to erase because I'm not going to be able to fit it all on my whiteboard anyway. I will just speak it out slowly and let you take it down and review it on your own. Okay, Aristotle argues as follows. First, premise 1, he reasserts his foundational metaphysical thesis that substances have priority among the things that are. So premise 1, substances have priority among the things that are. Therefore, he concludes, premise 2, if all substances are destructible, all things are destructible. Premise 2, if substances are all destructible, all things are destructible. But in that case, premise 3, movement is destructible. Movement is destructible. Premise 3, movement is destructible. Premise 4 is a premise about time and its relationship to movement or motion. 4, time is either movement itself or some affection of movement. Premise 4, time is either movement itself or some affection of movement. Premise 5, hence, if movement is destructible, time is destructible. Premise 5, if movement is destructible, time is destructible. Premise 6, but time is not destructible. In here, we might want to insert a little sub-argument. What would lead Aristotle to conclude that time is not destructible? And he seems to be reasoning something like this. I mean, this is, somewhat speculative, but I think you can read between the lines from a couple of things he says to see that this might be plausibly construed as a line of argument that he's employing. So here's the line of argument to the conclusion for premise 6 that time is not destructible. 1, if time is destroyed, it must be destroyed at some time. If time is destroyed, it must be destroyed at some time. 2, this means there must be a time before it is destroyed, in which it is, and a time after it is destroyed, in which it is not. 3, hence there must be a time after time goes out of existence. There must be a time after time goes out of existence. 4, but if there is such a time, then time hasn't gone out of existence after all. 5, hence, even if time were to be destroyed, it would still exist. Even if time were to be destroyed, it would still exist. And 6, this means that time cannot be destroyed. So, once again, very quickly, if time is destroyed, it must be destroyed at some time. This means there must be a time before it is destroyed, in which it is, and a time after it is destroyed, in which it is not. Hence, there must be a time after time goes out of existence. But if there is such a time, then time hasn't gone out of existence after all. Hence, even if time were to be destroyed, it would still exist. This means time cannot be destroyed. So that gives us premise 6. Time is not destructible. 7, therefore, not all substances are destructible. Conclusion, there must be at least one indestructible substance. So once again, the argument is this. 1, substances have priority among things that are. 2, if substances are all destructible, all things are destructible. 3, movement is destructible. 4, time is either movement itself or some affection of movement. 5, if movement is destructible, time is destructible. 6, but time is not destructible due to this sub-argument that I gave. 7, therefore not all substances are destructible. 8, conclusion, there must be at least one indestructible substance. So this leads us to the third discussion question. Is this argument for there being at least one indestructible substance a sound argument? Is this argument that I've just gone through a sound argument? That is to say, is it a valid argument? Are all the premises true? Which premise do you find to be the most questionable? Third discussion question. Is this argument for there being at least one indestructible substance a sound argument? Which premise do you find to be the most questionable? So we have the conclusion that there is at least one indestructible substance. How do we get from this to the conclusion that there must be an eternal unmoved substance? Remember, that's what we're trying to get to, the eternal unmoved substance. So the conclusion that we have so far is a conclusion there must be at least one indestructible substance. How do we get from that to the conclusion that there must be an eternal unmoved substance? We've got the single indestructible substance. How do we get to that? We've also established at this point that time and movement are indestructible. And by a parallel line of reasoning, time and movement cannot have come into existence. You could run that little argument I gave before, you could run that argument about time once again, except this time, instead of talking about a time before it is destroyed in which it is, and a time after it is destroyed in which it is not, just substitute a time before it came into being in which it is not, and a time after it came into being in which it is, and make the appropriate changes in the argument, and you would get the conclusion that not only can time not be destroyed, but also it cannot come into being. So, time and movement, which Aristotle is clearly closely associating here, and that's something certainly to think about. But time and movement, he wants to say, neither came into being nor went out of being. In other words, they are eternal. That is his understanding here of eternal. Something that neither came into being nor went out into being, nor went out of being. Neither came into being nor went out of being is eternal, an eternal thing. So Aristotle asks, under what conditions can movement be eternal? Under what conditions can movement be eternal? We already know that it is eternal, but now we want to ask, what more can we infer once we've concluded that movement is eternal? Note here that movement and time are non-substantial categories. They're not prior to substance. They're not prior to substance, which is the primary type of being for Aristotle, of course. So movement cannot exist in itself. It must exist in connection with some substance which moves. Remember, Aristotle had said at the beginning of Lambda that these relational categories, these non-substantial categories, really, strictly speaking, don't exist at all. Movement doesn't exist in itself. It only exists as the movement of some substance. It only exists in connection with some substance. So movement needs to be moved by some substance that's capable of movement. And from this, it seems Aristotle wants to conclude that there must be an eternal substance. An eternal substance. This, however, would seem to be a fallacious inference, simply because every movement and every time must be connected to a substance, and movement is eternal. It does not follow that there must be some substance that is eternal. It would follow, from what we've established so far, that at every time there must be a substance. But that's distinct from saying that there's one substance that exists at every time. Which is the implication of saying there's an eternal substance, right? So this does not imply an eternal substance to say at every time there must be a substance, some substance or other. It doesn't follow from that there's one substance that exists at every time. That is, that there's an eternal substance. So Aristotle's not logically entitled to make the inference to an eternal substance yet. However, there's more to the argument. He's not done. He seems to want to argue like this. And once again, I'm going to go through this argument. There are 11 premises to this argument, including the conclusion. The second stage of the argument. Okay. Premise 1. Only what is active in a substance can cause movement. Only what is active in a substance can cause movement. Premise 2. Only what is actual in a substance is active. Only what is actual in a substance is active. Premise 3. Hence, what is potential in a substance is not active. What is potential in a substance is not active. Premise 4. What is potential in a substance, therefore, must be activated by another substance, and this in turn by a prior substance, and so on. What is potential in a substance, therefore, must be activated by another substance, and this in turn by a prior substance, and so on. Premise 5. At the beginning of this chain, if there is a substance with potentiality and actuality, the potentiality can never be activated. At the beginning of this chain, if there is a substance with potentiality and actuality, the potentiality can never be activated. Why can't the potentiality not be activated? Well, on this hypothesis, it's the beginning of the causal chain, and there's no prior substance to activate it, right? So that gives us premise 5. At the beginning of this chain, if there is a substance with potentiality and actuality, the potentiality can never be activated. Premise 6. But a potentiality that can never be activated is no potentiality at all. Remember, we saw this as a previous conclusion that Aristotle drew in order to preserve the concept of impossibility. A potentiality that can never be activated is no potentiality at all. Premise 7. Hence, the beginning of the chain has no potentialities, only actuality. It is pure actuality. Add that here because this is going to be a crucial aspect of his idea of what the eternal unmoved substance is. It's pure actuality. So premise 7, hence the beginning of the chain has no potentialities, only actuality. It is pure actuality. We might say pure act, pure activity. Premise 8, this would be a self-moved mover. And we'll add this to our list of descriptions because it is another crucial aspect of Aristotle's conception of what the eternal unmoved substance would be. It would not only be unmoved, but also would be a self-moved mover. Premise 9. If there is to be generation or destruction, one thing must act upon another thing to generate it or destroy it. So if there is to be such a thing as generation or destruction of a thing, one thing must act upon it, another thing, to generate it or destroy it. So premise 9 is, if there is to be generation or destruction, one thing must act upon another thing. Premise 10. However, in the case of the self-moved mover, there is nothing that could act upon it. In the case of the self-moved mover, there is nothing that could act upon it. It is pure act itself. It acts on other things, but it's never acted upon. That's the idea. It has no potentialities to be activated, no potentialities to be realized. Therefore, the conclusion, premise 11, or conclusion, the self-moved mover is capable of being neither created nor destroyed. It is eternal. Okay, so there's the argument again. Once more, very quickly. 1, only what is active in a substance can cause movement. 2, only what is actual in a substance is active. 3, hence, what is potential in a substance is not active. 4, what is potential in a substance, therefore, must be activated by another substance, and this in turn by a prior substance, and so on. 5, at the beginning of this chain, if there is a substance with potentiality and actuality, the potentiality can never be activated. 6, but a potentiality that can never be activated is no potentiality at all. 7, hence the beginning of the chain has no potentialities, only actuality. It is pure actuality. 8, this would be a self-moved mover. 9. If there is to be generation or destruction, one thing must act upon another thing. 10. However, in the case of the self-moved mover, there is nothing that could act upon it. 11. Therefore, conclusion, the self-moved mover is capable of being neither created nor destroyed. It is eternal. This leads us to the fourth discussion question. Is this argument for an eternal unmoved mover a sound argument? Which premise do you find to be the most questionable? Of course, you might also understand Aristotle's reasoning here differently. I'm reconstructing it quite freely here, so that we can, of course, discuss that exegetical question as well. But I think this is a reasonable interpretation and one of the stronger cases that could be made on Aristotle's behalf. Okay, Lambda 7. In this chapter, Aristotle fills in the details of his unmoved mover, which he identifies, unsurprisingly, with the divine or with God. The first detail to settle is to explain how the unmoved mover moves. That is, how it affects other things and brings them into motion. Aristotle faces a restriction on the possible types of causation that could explain the causal efficacy of an unmoved mover. Because as pure actuality, such a being would be completely lacking in matter. Remember, matter is potentiality, so nothing could be less material than an unmoved mover. The unmoved mover has to be understood as an immaterial substance, an immaterial being. And as an immaterial being, the unmoved mover cannot move other things through efficient causality, like a rower rowing a boat or a workman pushing a cart. However, Aristotle observes that we do have an example in our experience of a type of causality involving an unmoved mover. And on 373, he lays out what this is. Where he says, this is where it says B there. This is towards the beginning of Lambda 7. He says, now it is just in this way that the object of desire and the object of thought produce movement. They move without being moved. And indeed, the primary objects of both are the same. The object of appetite is what seems good, and the primary object of wish is what really is good. This implies that the unmoved mover is intrinsically good and desirable, and it is its goodness that is responsible for attracting motion toward it. As a primary or first mover, however, the unmoved mover is not just any old good or desirable thing, it is the best and most desirable. The prime mover for Aristotle functions as the ultimate end of all things, the ultimate goal, the best or most perfect goal. And that's how it moves. Aristotle goes on to assert that the unmoved mover must enjoy continuously a life that is like ours in its best movements. Its best moments, rather. Not movements, its best moments. The unmoved mover enjoys a life like ours in its best moments. What characterizes our best moments? To answer this, Aristotle borrows from his ethical theory to argue that it is a life that's engaged in the highest possible activity. And this activity is thought, thinking. Why? Well, in engaging with thought, we are most free and most independent. Our only limitations are the intrinsic limitations of our own mind, which we don't feel to be limitations. So this is the highest and the best and the most pleasurable activity. Our thought is most pleasant, moreover, when it's directed towards objects that are similarly free and independent and self-contained. Eternal things, the objects of philosophy, like the unmoved mover itself. So in our best moments of our life, we think of things like the unmoved mover. What does the unmoved mover think of then? Itself, of course. It's pure thought that thinks itself. And that's what he says in the bottom of 274. If you look around F and I there where it says in the middle of the page, the intrinsic object of thought is what is intrinsically best. And the intrinsic object of absolute thought is the absolutely best. And in apprehending its object, thought thinks itself. And he goes on to describe how this is the best and most pleasant life to live. So that's how the unmoved mover moves, by attracting and drawing everything to it and its perfect life, which is a life of pure thought. Okay, Lambda 10, very briefly. Most of what Aristotle does in this chapter is to argue for the superiority of his theology and cosmology to those of his great predecessors. And in particular, he wants to make the point that whereas his predecessors tended to posit opposites as the ultimate principles of the universe, like Empedocles' love and strife or Plato's forms and particulars, the only adequate cosmology is one that has three distinct principles. The form and its privation, and the underlying matter or substrate. Now, Aristotle also says here that not only is God good, but the universe as a whole possesses a goodness that is derived from God, like the good general of an army imparts his goodness to the army, or the good leader of a household imparts his goodness to his household. So the goodness is imparted to this universe of substances which themselves have an underlying substrate. It will be interesting, though, to reflect upon how Aristotle's God explains this substrate. It explains the composition of a substance, but not, it seems, its substrate. Aristotle's God is not a creator of stuff, ex nihilo, it would seem, but only a principle of change within existence that explains why things strive towards realizing their perfection or their actualization, but not why there's anything rather than nothing, not why there's matter, not why there's stuff, or so it would seem. So this leads us to the fifth discussion question. How does Aristotle's conception of God, as we've just outlined it, compare to other conceptions with which you are familiar? Is it a convincing or appealing conception? What are its strengths and weaknesses?